Hello, my name is Robert Emmett Hernan. I'm the head of Bluestack Productions, Inc., the publisher of Irish Environment, an online resource for environmental matters on the island of Ireland. And we're here today for another in our series of conversations on environmental matters. And today I'm very pleased to be talking with John Gibbons. John, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Bob.
John is an environmental journalist and writer and has his own blog called Thinkorswim. And for 2 years was a columnist for the Irish Times.
That's right.
And is continuing to write tellingly and clearly about environmental issues. And John, I thought maybe recently you've been writing about the role of the media and the falling role of the media with regard to climate change. I wonder if you could tell the audience what that view is.
Sure. I suppose my own background is as a journalist, and I suppose I've been shocked and disappointed at the extent to which journalism, both globally and here in Ireland, has simply lost focus on climate. So I did some research on this and examined the performance, say, for example, of our national broadcaster RTE, of the Irish Times, our leading quality newspaper. And what I found is that essentially they've completely dropped the ball on climate and environmental issues. RTE, for example, their position of environment correspondent has fallen into abeyance, and they've now said they're not even interested in refilling the position. The Irish Times, its intensity of coverage of climate issues has declined by 75% in 3 years. The problem is getting worse, and the coverage is disappearing. Now, to me, as a journalist, I find those two positions extremely difficult to square. If a problem is getting worse, we need to up our coverage, not drop our coverage. And for example, in 2009, ahead of the Copenhagen climate conference, the Irish Times joined 55 other major newspapers from all around the world in printing front page editorials demanding that political leaders take action now while we still could. Literally, the world is burning, we must act, we must stand together. And unfortunately, the media, having climbed to the top of the hill, they've marched right back down the hill again, and nothing has happened. And I think this is possibly the tragedy of our age.
In the article that you wrote on that you pointed out there in the Irish Times, there's been a falling off of the use of the term, reference to the terms global warming and climate change, and substantially over the last 3 or 4 years. And I'm wondering, one of the issues in the States is that in fact there's a whole body of thinking and people who are saying don't mention the word global climate change because it sets off such a reaction in certain areas in the United States. So they say, talk about energy crisis or energy security. Do you think that's part of it, or do you think there's just a...
I can assure you that the decline is both qualitative and quantitative. This isn't simply a case of changing of linguistic acrobatics. This is an absolute decline, sharp disappearance in focus of coverage. I really think it is a dilemma, and I do have sympathy for newspaper editors. The dilemma here is this. Back in 2007, the IPCC Fourth Assessment Report set it out clearly and plainly, and that is we're in the grip of a tightening crisis. And at that time there was a sense, I think the media atmosphere, for example, had been primed with Al Gore's film the previous year, and I think there was a general sense that we're going to have to deal with this. In tandem with that, we had, if you like, a counter-reformation of counter-knowledge, which was then put in play, and that came to a head 2 years later with the so-called ClimateGate scandal. And where it's left, I think a lot of newspaper editors who maybe have never sat down and actually read a book or two on the subject, therefore they're depending really on what's coming through the wires. And what it's left them with is, okay, well, some people say it's a problem, other people say it's not a problem, so we're journalists, we're objective, we're going to sit in the middle and say, well, if you say it's a problem, I'm going to find someone who says it isn't a problem and tell you what, we'll split the difference. Now, unfortunately, physics doesn't work that way, as you well know. We can't simply take solid scientific advice on the one hand and decide to counterweigh it with industry special pleading and then split the difference and let's say, how about we do nothing for another 20 years? Unfortunately, that option is no longer available to us.
Now, why do you think there is this falling off? You explained one reason, in the economy you think is affecting it?
There's no question. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt that since the economic crisis of 2008, 2009, both in the US and here in Ireland, obviously the media, it's difficult for a dog to have more than one bone in its mouth at any one time. So, if you like, the climate bone was dropped, the economic bone was picked up. Now, I think another problem is newspapers like stories that appear to have beginning, middle and end. You like to say, well, here's the issue, here's the resolution, here's the photographs. The climate story is such a difficult story. We as the journalistic community, and I absolutely include myself in this, we are not neutral players. We are not messenger boys carrying messages to whoever. Somebody hands me a message. Is it my job to bring that message to the public? Not to query, who are you? You've given me a message. Are you a scientist? Have you published research? Why are you saying this? Who's sponsoring you? Journalists are not challenging people. They're not saying, hang on, you know, you're claiming this without evidence. You know, and when people put forward unrealistic propositions, they have to be challenged. Unfortunately, journalism is getting itself into the role of referee, whereas I believe a much more important role is the role of arbiter. We've got to be sufficiently able to make distinctions and make editorial calls. And people say, oh, well, then you're taking sides, John. You know, you're an activist, you're an advocate. Journalists do this every day of the week. Unfortunately, what's happened with climate science is, of course, it's become political. And I think that the game book for this, as you well know, has already been written, say, through the what they call the tobacco strategy, which goes back 50, 60 years, where irrefutable medical evidence was brought forward that showed that tobacco would kill, on average, 1 in 2 of the people who used it. Now, this was really bad news for the tobacco industry, because killing your customers is bad for business. So they had a choice. They could either accept that, work with regulators, and accept, if you like, a highly regulated tobacco industry, or they could tell a pack of lies and say, no, the scientists are corrupt. The scientists are only doing this for research grants. Oh, it's a conspiracy against our freedom. The playbook that I'm describing here, you'll have heard it over and over again since that time. It's called the tobacco strategy. It's been written up and explained, and it's a strategy designed to cast out and befuddle.
It's interesting because the tobacco fight, certainly in the States, took about 20 years to get over that argument. And the difficulty with climate change is that in the tobacco fight, we were able to say, you know, you're killing people now. Now with climate change, we're saying, well, you know, if you don't do something now, in 100 years or 50 years, somebody's going to have to sacrifice. That's a much harder sell. I mean, we know delayed gratification is you give up something now to get more pleasure later. We're saying give up something now for somebody else 2 generations later might suffer less. And that's a very hard sell. And if it took 20 years for tobacco, it's going to be a long fight, I think.
You're absolutely right. And I think another analogy that comes to mind in this was the battle to regulate CFCs back in the 70s and 80s. And curiously enough, the US at that time was, even with a Republican in the White House, the US was the lead player in getting nations together and saying, look, we've got the scientific evidence. Ozone thinning is happening. It's real. It's happening now, and it's going to get worse. And we're going to fix this. And even at that, the corporations, DuPont and so on, fought it tooth and nail. However, once they realised there was a buck in it, they just got on board.
Now, how do we get over this? I mean, this is a serious issue and a serious problem. And so, how do you propose that we get over this blockage in the media, or this failing to address the issue?
I think it's
more fulsomely.
And this is a massive problem. The media are supposed to be part of the solution. In this case, they're absolutely part of the problem. Where you have a corporatized media who identifies its interests with its corporate owners, who may also own large energy interests or have interests in that field, well then clearly they're simply using their media muscle to further a particular corporatized interest. Now, that's an enormous difficulty. Then you have the non-corporatized media, like we mentioned RTE, which has the luxury, if you like, of being a state broadcaster, or the Irish Times, which has the good fortune of being a trust. And here I think you're dealing more with a mixture of what they call climate fatigue and inertia. They just don't know how to cover this story. It's extraordinarily difficult. It's hitting us from all sides. And I honestly, personally believe that a lot of journalists, they just can't believe that this is for real. And you know why? Because there's never been a story like it. This is the proverbial meteor story. And like the meteor, it's out there, but you can't see it. And I think our rational brain says, no, it can't be. You know, the future is going to be like the past. You know, the 70s, the 80s were, you know, a bit more prosperous than the 70s, the 90s were a bit more prosperous than the 80s, etc. We have a picture of continuity in the world, and I think it's extremely difficult to dislodge that idea from our mind.
We've been concentrating really on the print and broadcast media. Do you think there's any hope or difference in the electronic media? You have your own blog, Thinkorswim, and you write extensively on that. And there's Twitter, there's Facebook. Do you think there's a difference in the electronic media on covering these issues?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that probably the key thing with the electronic media, of course, is that while large chunks of it is, of course, highly corporatized, there's also scope for individuals or for small groups who lack funding to still actually have quite a good impact online. Therefore, the advantage that the big guys have, say, in print and in terms of TV networks, the vast capital required to run these tend to mean that they end up being corporatized. You know, a good website can be done cheaply and efficiently. You can bring people together through social media and so on. So I do think that it's offering, if you like, a counterpoint to the dominant editorial voice, which is, as I say, is strongly corporatized. I think, you know, WikiLeaks is a very good example of this, where, you know, a very tiny budget project is having such significant effects in terms of redefining our relationship with power. And but I think as well, in the future, more and more people, particularly the under 30s and certainly the under 20s, they're consuming way more of their information, their knowledge through electronic media. They're not buying newspapers. Now, as an old print journalist, that pains me to say it, but it's true. And therefore, that's why people like me, we're moving online as well, as you have yourself, and following that audience online. And I would have some optimism that we can better create networks of shared interest online, because the problem with these type of stories is they're long and they're complex, and you can get into thousands of words writing up something in a blog or in an online space. You try and sell that to a newspaper editor, no chance. They'll just say, look, we've got too much else on, keep it to 500 words, keep it short, and by the way, try not to be too depressing, right? We're trying to cheer people up here. Because there is a crunch thing here, Bob. You know, the media is a branch of the entertainment business. In the end of the day, no matter what you say, it's a branch of the entertainment business. And TV stations, for example, are very much in the entertainment business. They're in the ratings business, and there's nothing designed to kill ratings more effectively than constant bad news, especially bad news that you've got no easy answer for.
Right. Well, on that optimistic note that there's some hope with the electronic media, I'm going to leave it, because when we talk about climate change, it's very hard to leave on a positive note. And it's delightful to see your passion hasn't waned at all. John, thanks very much for talking with us.
Thank you, Bob.